The sun rose lazily over the rotund gates of Silvercrest Pines, a gated community where the sidewalks were power-washed every Sunday. Trash bins were color-coded by regulation, and the HOA president, Karen Whitmore, ruled the neighborhood like a self-crowned queen, with perfectly frosted hair, a clipboard permanently attached to her hand, and an army of rules that stretched longer than the Declaration of Independence. Karen wasn't just feared, she was obeyed. She walked the streets at dawn, documenting grass lengths and unapproved flower colors, submitting fines before most people had poured their first cup of coffee. Her record for 911 calls had made local dispatchers so familiar with her voice they'd begun to assign a code to her name, K91, short for Karen False Report, Type 1, but it wasn't a joke. Her calls resulted in real consequences. Police showing up at a teenager's doorstep for parking 6 inches outside his garage, officers being sent to investigate a barbecue for being too smoky, even an elderly couple being cited for an unauthorized garden gnome because Karen swore it was part of a cult symbol, and because she was organized, methodical, and used the HOA charter like a weapon. She was rarely questioned, never challenged, and always protected by the fine print. That was until Jack Donovan moved in. Jack was quiet. Too quiet. No one saw a moving truck when he arrived. No one met the agent who sold him the house. He didn't wave at neighbors, didn't show up at HOA welcome meetings, and, most disturbingly, Karen didn't have a single record in the HOA's digital directory. No phone number, no spouse, no emergency contact, just a name. And for someone like Karen, a blank space meant danger. She visited his property herself, walking up the pristine brick path of the corner lot home that had sat empty for months. It was perfectly clean, no violations, but the blinds were always drawn. The mailbox was emptied at odd hours, and Jack rarely left. When he did, he wore a hat pulled low and walked like someone trained not to be seen. That's when Karen's obsession began. She wrote her first violation notice within days. Front shrubbery exceeds height regulation by 2.5 inches. No response, she escalated. Improper trash bin placements, 7:04 a.m. pickup not aligned with community rulebook. Still no response. Frustrated, she filed a complaint through the HOA board, but even they hesitated. We haven't received any dues from him either, one board member admitted. It's like his property was cleared outside the HOA purchase flow. Karen was furious. She began digging, first through public records, then real estate listings, then city planning documents. Nothing. Jack Donovan had somehow moved into Silvercrest Pines without being processed through the HOA. That wasn't just suspicious, it was unacceptable. Karen's next step was subtle but invasive. She used one of the HOA's surveillance drones, officially reserved for perimeter checks, and piloted it above Jack's backyard. Nothing but a small table, 2 chairs, and a closed patio umbrella. She buzzed closer, trying to peek through the window when the drone suddenly lost signal and plummeted into the hedges. 2 hours later, the HOA received an anonymous email with a video file attached. It was Karen, on camera, operating the drone with the HOA stamp on the side clearly visible. The subject line read, "Illegal HOA surveillance attempted on private property." It was unsigned. The board panicked. Karen was furious, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. She claimed the email was forged and the footage was fake. And yet, Jack never filed a formal complaint. He never spoke about it. He simply carried on. Untouched. That drove her mad. The next incident pushed her over the edge. Karen was walking her daily patrol when she noticed something subtle but unsettling. Jack had a mailbox with no HOA stamp. Every resident was required to install a specific style of mailbox, black steel, standardized by the community's design rules. His was sleek, matte, and modern. No logo, no approval. She marched up and snapped a picture. That night, she filed a 911 call stating that a suspicious man with no visible identification is modifying community infrastructure in defiance of legal code. The dispatcher asked, "Is anyone in danger?" "Ma'am." Karen hesitated, then said, "I don't know what he's hiding, but I think he's armed." That's all it took. Within 15 minutes, 2 patrol units arrived, sirens off, but hands on holsters. They approached Jack's door. He opened it before they knocked. "Can I help you?" he said calmly. "Sir, we received a call about potential threats or weapons on your property," one officer said. Jack didn't blink. "Do you have a warrant?" The officers hesitated. It was an anonymous tip. Jack stepped outside, arms visible, nothing in his hands. "I'm not armed. I'm not a threat. I'm a homeowner." Karen stood on her lawn filming it all with her phone, narrating to no one. "He's pretending to be harmless. This is how they operate." The officers eventually left, but the report was filed and so was Jack's quiet response. 3 days later, a civil rights attorney arrived at the HOA office with a printed notice, cease and desist on all further surveillance, harassment, or false reporting against Mr. Jack Donovan. Under federal statute 42 U.S.C. section 1983, it was signed not just by the law firm but by an official seal from the Department of Justice. The HOA board panicked again. Karen called an emergency meeting, screaming that this was a trick, a cover, a scare tactic. But the letter was real, and the next morning, Jack stood on his front porch, sipping coffee, watching as a Department of Justice vehicle drove past, slowly marking the first official presence of the federal government inside Silvercrest Pines. Rumors flew. Some thought he was a lawyer. Others thought he was but Karen began to suspect the one thing she couldn't control, that Jack Donovan wasn't just a quiet neighbor. He was here for her. She tripled her efforts, began calling in other members of the board for unsanctioned meetings, pulled old violation records from years ago. She wanted leverage, anything, but each step she took made things worse. People noticed. A neighbor she once fined for hosting noisy relatives began speaking to Jack over the hedge. Another homeowner who had quietly paid a $600 fine for a trampoline violation began asking if the HOA's bylaws were even legal. Karen's grip was slipping and Jack hadn't said a word. The final trigger came when Jack walked into the community clubhouse one morning and placed a small unmarked envelope on the main counter. Inside were 3 photos, a map, and a voice transcript. The HOA receptionist opened it, read it, and turned white. Within an hour, 2 board members resigned. One deleted their HOA email entirely. Karen tried to get the envelope back. It was gone. That night, Karen called 911 again, this time reporting that Jack had threatened her directly. He said he'd burned the whole HOA to the ground, she claimed. He's dangerous, I'm afraid for my life. The dispatcher, already familiar with her history, asked, "Do you have any proof of that, ma'am?" She said yes, but when police arrived and asked to see the proof, all she had was a blurry photo of Jack walking past her house holding a newspaper. The police left, but now someone else was watching too. 2 men in dark suits arrived in Silvercrest Pines the next morning and rang Karen's doorbell. They weren't local. They weren't police. They were federal investigators. They asked to speak with her about a pattern of false emergency reports, misuse of HOA authority, and possible federal violations regarding citizen harassment. Karen laughed in their faces and slammed the door, but they didn't leave. They knocked again, and when she refused to answer, they went to the HOA office instead with a subpoena. Jack watched from his porch, sipped his coffee, and finally just slightly smiled. The morning air was unusually still in Silvercrest Pines, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, while 2 federal agents calmly exited the HOA office with sealed folders in hand and expressions carved from stone. They had spent over an hour inside with the remaining board members cross-referencing past violation letters, reviewing body cam footage from Karen's recent 911 calls, and pulling digital records from HOA security drones that Karen swore were never deployed. But everything was time-stamped, catalogued, and too consistent to be denied. One folder contained evidence of over 30 false complaints filed by Karen in the last 8 months alone, each followed by excessive fines, neighborhood citations, or unwarranted police presence, many of which targeted the same homeowners repeatedly. When the agents approached Karen's home later that day, she refused to come to the door. Instead, she shouted through a locked window that they were harassing her and threatened to file a lawsuit. She claimed she had a legal team, connections with county officials, and warned that anything they tried to do would be met with political retaliation. The agents made no threats, offered no rebuttal, and simply handed an official envelope to the HOA secretary with Karen's name on it. Inside was a formal notice of pending investigation under federal civil rights statutes. No charges yet, the heavy weight of a looming storm. Jack Donovan, meanwhile, had become an unintentional legend among the residents. The man who never spoke at board meetings, never responded to Karen's notices, and never argued publicly had become the epicenter of the community's quiet rebellion. Neighbors who once whispered about him now nodded in silent respect. Small conversations began blooming on sidewalks, fathers who'd been fined for kids, sidewalk chalk sharing stories with mums who'd been threatened over party decorations. The mask that had covered Karen's long-standing reign was beginning to crack. Even the board members who hadn't resigned were suddenly quiet during meetings, unsure of how to defend a woman under federal scrutiny. But Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She doubled down instead. Within 48 hours, she submitted 3 new 911 calls, one claiming Jack had a drone flying illegally over her house, which was proven to be HOA property, not Jack's. Another stating that she heard explosive-sounding devices from his backyard, which turned out to be distant construction work. And the third, a dangerous lie that Jack had been recording children walking home from school. That last one triggered a serious response. 2 squad cars arrived and knocked on Jack's door again. This time he didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped out with his phone recording, handed the officers a sealed envelope, and said, "Please forward this to your supervisor." The officers, recognizing the seal on the envelope, readjusted their tone immediately. They didn't push further. They left. Later, the city precinct received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice confirming Jack Donovan's status as an active investigator assigned to multiple abusive authority complaints in suburban HOA jurisdictions. Word spread fast. Karen, however, refused to accept defeat. She called an emergency HOA board meeting and insisted it be closed to residents. Inside the dimly lit conference room, she ranted like a cornered animal, claiming Jack was a plant. a government stooge, and part of a wider conspiracy to dismantle independent community control. She demanded loyalty, threatened expulsion of any board member who questioned her orders. She proposed a secret vote to suspend Jack's access to HOA utilities, citing a clause buried deep in the bylaws about non-cooperative residents posing disruption. But this time, the board didn't go along. One member, a woman named Paige who had served quietly for 5 years, stood up and said, "Karen, if you proceed with this, I'll testify against you in court, and so will half the street." The room went silent. Karen's face turned from fury to panic, but she hid it behind a tight smile. The meeting ended without a vote. Karen left first. The rest stayed behind, whispering to each other like survivors after a storm. The following week, Karen became more erratic. She installed new cameras on her property, angled suspiciously to Jack's front yard, and began recording every movement. She accused local teenagers of vandalism with zero proof. She printed flyers and slipped them into mailboxes warning of infiltrators and deep state surveillance, urging residents not to speak to Jack or the federal agents lurking around. She even hired a private investigator that lasted exactly 1 visit. After just 10 minutes parked near Jack's home, the PI received a quiet phone call, looked pale, and drove away without a word. Karen never heard from him again. More interestingly, the local police department began ignoring her calls. Dispatchers flagged her number with a Category C, chronic false reporter tag, and officers were instructed to review body cam archives before responding to her complaints. She was now officially on record as a potential misuser. As case, ironically, one of the charges Jack's task force was actively studying. Then came the town hall incident. Karen, desperate to reclaim her authority, organized a community safety rally at the clubhouse. She advertised it as an informative event to help residents recognize threats and preserve neighborhood values. But when people showed up, they were shocked to find a projector screen filled with screenshots of Jack walking his dog, photos of unfamiliar vehicles parked on his street, and even an edited video of Jack speaking with the mailman cut together with ominous music and flashing red warning signs. She was attempting to smear him publicly, convince the neighborhood he was dangerous. But midway through her presentation, the screen froze, then flickered, then changed entirely. A new video began playing. It showed Karen, inside her own office, opening HOA violation files labeled with notes like "Make her life hell" and "Noise fine repeat offender target this week." It showed her speaking on speakerphone with another board member saying, "Just file the report, whether it's true or not. Police don't care as long as it sounds scary." The room gasped. Karen lunged for the projector, but it was too late. Jack stood in the back, arms crossed. The federal agents were there too, quietly taking notes, recording reactions. Someone clapped, then another. Then the room erupted, not in chaos, but in realization. Karen had exposed herself the next morning. Karen's house was surrounded not by angry neighbors or police, but by silence. No one waved at her anymore. Kids crossed the street when walking past her driveway. The HOA office had been closed pending legal review. Her email access had been revoked. And the biggest insult of all, her fines were being overturned one by one as Jack's team began reviewing every record going back 5 years. Homeowners were reimbursed. Apologies were issued, but the federal case wasn't closed, not yet. Jack was still there. Patient, building something deeper. Because this wasn't just about Karen's harassment. It was about the system that let her thrive. Jack knew that systems didn't break overnight. They had to be pulled apart slowly, layer by layer, like rotting wallpaper revealing mold underneath. And Karen, who had once believed herself invincible, now reduced to peeking through her blinds at a world she no longer controlled. The clipboard was gone. The fines vanished. The queen had been dethroned. But Jack wasn't finished. There were still layers to uncover, still allies of Karen's hiding in plain sight. And as far as he was concerned, Silvercrest Pines wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a case file. And it had only just begun. Karen hadn't slept properly in days. Her world, once built on micromanagement and unquestioned authority, was crumbling under the weight of silence from the community she once controlled. Silence from the HOA board that now treated her like a liability. And worst of all, the eerie, calculating silence of Jack Donovan, whose calm presence on his front porch had become more haunting than any siren she used to call down on others. She watched from behind curtained windows as he came and went, never breaking routine, never raising his voice, never making threats. That calm was Karen's undoing. She kept trying to provoke him, leaving passive-aggressive signs on his lawn, dropping anonymous notes in his mailbox, setting her sprinklers to drench his sidewalk every morning, but he responded with nothing but patience. And every move she made only added to his growing case file. Because unknown to her, Jack's surveillance wasn't limited to what she saw. His home had multiple hidden cameras legally installed, data encrypted, and directly connected to a federal server where investigators were quietly collecting a timeline of every incident, every fabricated violation, every illegal drone flight, and every 911 call she made since his arrival. Meanwhile, residents had begun speaking out, in private, then quietly at community gatherings, and finally online. An anonymous neighborhood blog titled Life Under Karen gained traction among the homeowners, detailing years of fines, public shaming, and private intimidation. Jack didn't write it, but he didn't stop it either. A mother named Claire wrote a post about how Karen once threatened to report her to CPS after her child left a scooter on the lawn. An elderly couple named the Harrisons described being fined for wind chimes deemed too loud, then mysteriously had their back fence damaged weeks later. These weren't isolated cases, they were patterns. Jack's team read every post, cross-referenced them with archived violation records, and slowly built a web of abuses that went far beyond Karen's clipboard. But Jack knew the legal structure of an HOA gave people like her power. Fines could be disputed but not his, rules could be challenged, but only with costly legal counsel. So he went deeper. Behind closed doors, Jack began investigating Karen's finances. With a court-approved order, his team traced every HOA-issued check signed by her, every discretionary expense filed in her name, and every transfer from the HOA's petty cash fund. That's when the first crack turned into a chasm. Karen had authorized dozens of reimbursements over the past 2 years for community safety equipment, including surveillance cameras, recording devices, and even drone repairs. But none of those items were listed as approved by the board, and several were traced directly to vendors who had no record of fulfilling those orders. In short, the money vanished. Jack traced one vendor address to a P.O. box in a nearby city. That led to a shell account created under the name Whitmore Community Services LLC, a company that didn't exist outside of paper. Karen had been funneling HOA funds into a fake business her own. By the time the financial report was compiled, it ran over 120 pages and detailed nearly $64,000 in misappropriated funds. Jack's team sent the dossier directly to the local district attorney's office and the state's Department of Financial Regulation. But Jack wasn't finished yet. The next step was triggering a legal mechanism buried in HOA policy itself, one that allowed for a full HOA audit and member vote for dissolution if more than 60% of the homeowners signed a petition citing abuse or corruption. Jack didn't knock on doors, he didn't need to. The petition showed up online, anonymous but legal, backed by enough documentation to convince even the most skeptical residents. Within 5 days, over 70% had signed it. Karen didn't know until it was too late. She burst into the community center, waving her phone and demanding to know who was behind it, only to find the HOA board sitting silently, no longer shielding her. "You're suspended until further notice pending legal investigation," said Page, now acting board president. Karen shouted, accused, and threatened lawsuits. She called 911 once again, screaming that she was being harassed by a conspiracy of neighbors and secret agents. But when officers arrived and saw Jack standing in the corner with an official badge in his hand, they didn't even write a report. They just walked her outside and told her to calm down. For a week, Karen vanished from view. Her blinds stayed drawn, her porch unlit, her once frequent patrols gone. People assumed she was planning some kind of legal counterattack, but what no one saw was the breakdown happening inside. Karen had built her identity around control of lawns, of rules, of fear, and now she was powerless. She tried reaching out to old allies, a councilman she once helped fundraise for, a city inspector who owed her a favor, even her brother-in-law at the county zoning office. But no one wanted to be associated with a federal investigation. The silence became unbearable. And that's when Karen did something desperate. One night she walked to Jack's house. No cameras, no clipboard, just her. She rang the doorbell. Jack answered, expression unreadable. She didn't speak right away. Then she said, "What do you want? Money? A public apology? Just tell me how to stop this." Jack didn't blink. He said, "It's not about stopping. It's about accountability. You hurt people, Karen. You used fear like a weapon. I'm just the one who finally had the tools to push back." She stood there in stunned silence. For the first time, no threat, no rebuttal came out of her mouth. She just turned and walked away. The next day, a court summons arrived at her home. Federal civil charges were being filed: fraud, harassment, abuse of power, and obstruction of an active investigation. Karen sat at her dining table, staring at the thick stack of paperwork with trembling hands. Her phone buzzed, but she didn't pick up. Her lawyer stopped answering. The HOA board held a formal vote. She was permanently removed. Residents gathered that evening in a quiet celebration, not loud or cruel, but solemn. A weight had lifted. Jack attended for the first time, not as a hero, but as a neighbor. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Claire thanked him. The Harrisons offered him homemade pie. Even Paige smiled and said, "You didn't just stop her. You showed us we could fight back." But Jack knew the work wasn't over. His report would eventually reach Washington. His findings, anonymized and cross-referenced with similar communities across the country, would be used to draft recommendations on HOA reform and legal accountability. Silvercrest Pines wasn't the only community like this. It was just the one that had finally cracked wide open. As the sun set behind the houses, Jack stood quietly, watching children ride bikes down a street that had once been ruled by fear. He knew there were still embers burning. Karen wasn't done. Not yet. There were still secrets buried in her records. And while the neighborhood felt peace for the first time in years, Jack remained vigilant because sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who feels cornered, with nothing left to lose. The quiet that fell over Silvercrest Pines in the wake of Karen Whitmore's removal from the HOA board was unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced in years. For once, there were no warning letters slipped under doors, no fines posted, 2 community portals for non-regulation, patio umbrellas, and no random HOA-authorized foot patrols, measuring grass height with rulers and taking pictures of Halloween decorations 2 days after the holiday. Residents, still cautious but visibly lighter in spirit, began reclaiming their spaces. Bikes reappeared on sidewalks, kids' chalk art spread across driveways without threat of being washed off, and lawn chairs, those unspeakable unauthorized outdoor relaxations, returned to front porches in defiance of the outdated aesthetic rules Karen had weaponized for so long. And yet for Jack Donovan, the end of Karen's public presence was only the midpoint of the larger investigation, because what he had uncovered in Silvercrest Pines wasn't just a case of one woman abusing her position. It was a reflection of a broken system and checked private power wrapped in the language of community upkeep and order, where the rules were selectively enforced, the leadership unaccountable, and the consequences dangerously real for anyone who questioned the wrong person. He knew from experience that people like Karen didn't vanish quietly. They regrouped, rebrand, and come back with smarter strategies once they've licked their wounds, and that suspicion became reality sooner than he expected. When, one morning, Paige knocked on Jack's door holding an envelope that had been hand-delivered overnight to her mailbox that had no stamp, no return address, just a typed note inside that read, "HOAs don't die, they evolve. Watch your back." Paige was shaken. Jack took the letter, bagged it in a small evidence pouch, and slipped it into his office drawer without a word. Karen had clearly gone underground. She wasn't filing public complaints anymore, but subtle signs of her influence began to resurface, in odd, quiet ways. A new HOA committee formed calling itself the Community Standards Renewal Board, supposedly independent of the dissolved HOA, but suspiciously led by 2 former board members who had always backed Karen. Flyers reappeared, urging residents to support property value restoration and quiet zone enforcement. The language was sanitized, professional, but Jack could see Karen's fingerprints all over it. Her style had shifted from confrontation to subversion. No more drone stunts or shouting matches. This was infiltration. Her goal now was not just revenge, it was reinstatement under a new name, a clean slate, and Jack's silence would be the price. But Jack had already decided this time he wouldn't just wait for her to make a mistake. He would get ahead of her. He started by digging into her digital presence. While Karen had deleted her official HOA email and shut down her neighborhood portal accounts, Jack's team found traces of a new identity operating through encrypted community forums, designed for property managers and self-styled consultants. Under the pseudonym C. Whitstone, Karen had been publishing articles and interacting with other HOA leaders across the state, offering advice on reasserting control post-crisis, eliminating disruptive elements from community structures, and most troubling, reorganizing boards without triggering legal audits. Her posts had gained traction. She was building an audience, crafting herself into a guru for authoritarian HOA operators who viewed homeowner empowerment as a threat. Jack pulled every post, scraped every IP address traceable to her location, and created a new dossier: Operation Rebirth. This wasn't just about Karen returning, this was about her trying to spark a movement. Jack escalated the case to his federal contacts and was granted expanded jurisdiction to investigate the potential proliferation of civil rights abuse tactics within private residential governance models. It was rare, language legal. It gave him the green light to not just stop Karen but expose the network forming around her. Meanwhile, Karen had shifted tactics at the local level too. Her house had gone from a silent bunker to a quiet hub of activity. Cars with out-of-state plates began visiting late at night. The windows remained covered, but motion-sensitive lights flickered in patterns that Jack recognized from surveillance countermeasure training. She was actively shielding her movements. One night, Jack's camera picked up 2 men entering through her back gate with tool bags. They stayed for less than 30 minutes and left without speaking to anyone. The next day, Paige reported that the HOA server, now archived but stored locally, had been tampered with. Log files were missing. Digital audit trails were partially erased, and in place of several complaint records, someone had inserted nonsense files with corrupted timestamps. It was a targeted scrub. Karen wasn't just trying to reinvent herself, she was trying to erase the past entirely. Jack called in a digital forensics specialist from his task force. The server was seized and cloned. What they found stunned even the seasoned investigators. Karen had installed keystroke trackers on board members' logins, had remote backdoor access to modify community records in real time, and had written multiple emails under other board members' names to simulate consensus during her worst abuses. The entire HOA structure had, at one point, become a puppet show operated by one woman behind a keyboard and a false sense of legitimacy. Jack now had enough to file formal charges for digital fraud, identity misrepresentation, and data tampering. But he didn't stop there. He knew that if Karen went down again, she'd just re-emerge somewhere else. So he decided to set a trap not to punish her, but to finally expose her in a way that couldn't be denied, twisted, or silenced. With cooperation from Paige and a few key residents, Jack helped organize a community redevelopment vote, this time a real one, designed to legally replace all former HOA bylaws with a new charter that banned individual authority from overriding homeowner decisions. The meeting would be public, live-streamed and monitored by legal observers. Jack anticipated Karen would make a move. She didn't disappoint. The night before the vote, Karen sent anonymous messages to several homeowners, urging them not to attend, claiming it was a federal scheme to install surveillance controls under the guise of freedom. She tried to stir paranoia, suggested Jack was actually a federal spy collecting data on private citizens, even accused Paige of being bribed. But this time it didn't work. People were tired. They had tasted life without Karen's rule, and they weren't going back. The meeting was packed. Over 80% attendance. Jack sat quietly near the back, listening as Paige explained the vote. She never mentioned Karen's name, but her shadow loomed in every word. When it came time to vote, the results were unanimous and heard of in Silvercrest Pines. The new charter passed. Karen's old world was legally dead, and then, in an unexpected twist, Karen stood up at the back of the room. She had entered unnoticed, wearing sunglasses and a dark coat. Her voice cracked slightly when she spoke. "You think you've won," she said. "You think replacing a few words in a document changes the truth. But people like me are necessary. We keep order. We protect standards. We preserve value. Without structure, this place will rot." No one replied. Jack looked at her, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. She turned and walked out. That night, she posted a final message on her underground forum. "The neighborhood has fallen to chaos. I was removed by a smear campaign, but I will rise again, somewhere else under a new name." Jack archived the post, tagged it, and sent it to federal monitors. Her signature was already known in their system. She wouldn't get far. Back in Silvercrest Pines, the aftermath wasn't loud, it was healing. People started planting flowers without HOA approval. A neighbor set up a community garden on land that had once been flagged as undevelopable green space. The clubhouse was repurposed into a co-op workspace. Jack, for his part, declined any offers for honorary roles or neighborhood committees. He said his job was almost done, almost because he knew the war wasn't over just this battle. Karen's tactics weren't isolated. Across the country, there were hundreds of HOAs like Silvercrest Pines, where people in power used rules as weapons and order as a mask for personal control. Jack's next assignment would take him to another neighborhood, another Karen, another fight. But for now, as the sun set over a street finally free from fear, Jack stood on his porch for the last time, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood breathe easy. Paige walked by and waved. Claire's daughter rode her bike past without checking over her shoulder. That Harrison's put up new wind chimes. A quiet neighborhood had found its voice again, and the man who helped restore it stepped back into the shadows, ready to do it all over again, because peace is never permanent when people like Karen are left unchecked, and Jack Donovan had made it his mission to ensure they never ruled unchallenged again. 3 months had passed since Silvercrest Pines voted to dissolve the old HOA charter and restructure its entire governance system, and in that short time, the once suppressed neighborhood had transformed into a place that barely resembled the tightly controlled regime Karen Whitmore had ruled. Residents painted their homes with brighter colors. A community tool-sharing shed replaced the unused and heavily restricted HOA storeroom, and a local food truck now parked every Friday near the park without the threat of code enforcement descending upon it. Jack Donovan, though still officially residing in the neighborhood, had begun packing up his belongings and discreetly shipping them off-site. His job in Silvercrest was almost finished. But there was one final chapter left to close, one that loomed even larger than Karen's lingering shadow: the systematic corruption embedded in the HOA infrastructure that allowed people like her to thrive in the first place. While Karen's personal influence had been stripped and her public image had been quietly dismantled through both legal proceedings and undeniable public backlash, the deeper problem remained that she hadn't been alone. Jack's ongoing investigation had uncovered a small but dangerous network of HOA leaders, regional consultants, and property management attorneys who used legal loopholes, fraudulent shell companies, and intimidation to control and extract from their communities under the guise of safety and order. Karen was merely one of the more aggressive operators. Others were still active, thriving off the same techniques she used, cloaked in professionalism and protected by complex contracts that homeowners rarely understood until it was too late. With clearance from his task force and new subpoenas in hand, Jack turned his attention to the connections Karen had maintained beyond Silvercrest Pines. He started with C. Whitstone, the pseudonym Karen had used to interact on online HOA consultancy forums, Through careful tracking, his team matched multiple accounts and email addresses back to a single server hub operating out of a law firm in Raleigh, North Carolina, known for aggressively defending HOAs accused of overreach. That law firm, which had never officially represented Silvercrest Pines, had been quietly advising Karen during her last year in power, helping her draft letters that sounded threatening without being legally actionable, and even recommending how to structure fines to avoid triggering the unreasonable fee clauses built into some state regulations. Karen's digital signature was found on at least 12 memos between that firm and other problem board presidents in 4 different counties. With this evidence, Jack compiled what the DOJ referred to internally as a community exploitation matrix, a visual map of HOA power brokers who facilitated abuse through legal camouflage. Each thread from Karen's behavior now became a wire in a much larger circuit of corruption, and the pattern was unmistakable. Abuse wasn't the byproduct of overzealous enforcement, it was a business model still. Despite the damning evidence, Karen hadn't been charged with anything beyond her civil violations, and that disturbed Jack deeply. He knew she hadn't simply retreated into obscurity. His surveillance team picked up signals from a burner phone activated in a small mountain town 2 counties north. Then a new housing development began receiving reports of anonymous safety concerns, design disputes, and unannounced inspections. The descriptions were familiar middle-aged woman, well-dressed, articulate, deeply concerned about safety protocols and aesthetic harmony, often accompanied by vague threats of contacting legal counsel or calling the police. When Jack received a tip from a resident in that area who found his name through an old news article and begged for help, he didn't hesitate. He drove upstate, disguised as a potential homebuyer, and attended a local planning meeting where concerns were being raised about a new community board advisor who'd recently joined the developer's residential outreach team. Her name wasn't Karen Whitmore, it was Claire Windsor. She wore her hair slightly darker now, had new glasses, and went by her middle name, but the voice, the tone, the attitude, all of it was unmistakable. She was already setting the groundwork. To start over, Jack watched from the back of the room as Claire outlined a series of suggestions to limit outside foot traffic and reconsider placement of community benches to avoid loitering. She didn't scream this time, she wasn't aggressive. She spoke with polished restraint and pretended to smile as if she were offering guidance, not control. But Jack knew the cycle was beginning again. After the meeting, he walked up to her as she exited the building. She didn't recognize him at first, then her expression froze. "You," she said quietly. Jack didn't raise his voice. "You thought changing your name would erase what you did," he said. "But all you did was confirm that you'll never stop until someone stops you permanently." She forced a smile, shrugged, and said, "I've broken no laws here. I'm just a concerned resident." Jack handed her an envelope containing photos, audio transcripts, and digital records tracing her identity change. "You broke enough the first time," he said. "This is already on its way to the district attorney's office and your developer partners." Karen's face twitched, but she didn't speak. She turned and walked away. But the next morning she was gone again, house empty, phone disconnected, email address deleted. Back at Silvercrest Pines, Jack presented his full report to a special, joint session of the DOJ and the Federal Housing Oversight Commission. The evidence Karen left behind, her practices, her connections, her replication methods would now become part of a new national investigation into HOA abuse and residential civil rights violations. His documentation would be used to draft a legislative bill designed to introduce mandatory transparency in HOA governance, limit unilateral authority, and provide whistleblower protections for residents. Silvercrest Pines had become the catalyst for federal reform, not just a neighborhood saved, but a landmark case in dismantling systemic abuse hiding under bureaucracy. For Jack, the mission was far from over. Karen had slipped away again, but now her name, aliases, and methods were flagged across multiple federal systems. She wouldn't be able to operate in the shadows anymore. His work had triggered something, larger movement, quiet but growing, where everyday homeowners began asking questions, reading bylaws, organizing against unjust boards, and sharing their own Karen encounters with newfound courage. Jack's final week in Silvercrest was quiet. No press, no farewell speech, no honors. He packed his things, mailed a few final documents to DOJ headquarters, and gave his house keys to a new resident, a single mother named Leslie who had been forced out of her last neighborhood for refusing to paint her home beige after a personal tragedy. She cried when he handed her the papers, not because of the house, but because for once, she felt like someone had fought for her right to live without fear. That night, Jack stood at the edge of the park watching the sun fall behind the trees. Paige joined him, handing him a thermos of coffee. "You'll be missed," she said. "You didn't just change things here, you changed us." Jack looked across the field at children playing freely, a dog running without a leash, and families setting up lawn chairs without checking over their shoulders. "You were always strong," he said. "You just needed a little room to breathe." And with that, he walked away from Silvercrest Pines for the last time. Not because the fight was over, but because the next one had already begun somewhere else. 2 states away, in a gated lakeside neighborhood called Brookridge Cove, a fresh nightmare was just beginning to take root. The community was quiet on the surface: white picket fences, speed bumps every 100 feet, and professionally manicured hedges lining every driveway. But underneath the postcard perfection was a rising tension no one outside had noticed yet. There had been whispers for weeks about a new compliance officer being brought in under a consulting contract by the development group managing the area. No one had met her directly. She operated through emails and HOA newsletters signed only CW at first. The residents chalked it up to formality. Maybe the company was expanding, or maybe they were trying to streamline enforcement. But then the letters began. A woman named Renee, who had lived there for nearly 6 years, received a warning about unapproved solar lighting on her walkway. Then a military veteran named Travis got a $150 fine for excessive flag display, despite having the same single pole he'd had for years. Others began getting citations for fence shades, holiday decorations, noise complaints that were never verified, and even yard signs that simply read "Welcome." No one had ever seen the person issuing them. There were no hearings, no transparency, just escalating penalties. And when a group of concerned homeowners asked for a meeting with the HOA board, they were told the compliance officer didn't operate under direct community oversight. That's when one of them, a retired IT specialist named Greg, ran the email, parsed through a trace, and discovered the address had been masked through a multi-hop encryption path, but still linked back to a dormant domain once registered in the name of Claire Windsor. By the time Greg found Jack Donovan's archived name from a homeowners' rights forum and sent a desperate email, he was already weeks deep into another assignment on the East Coast, helping prepare a legal brief on digital privacy violations committed by quasi-governmental neighborhood bodies. But when he saw the forwarded emails from Brookridge Cove, especially the language used in the violations and the signature initials, he felt a sickening familiarity. The sentence structures, the passive-aggressive tone, the strategic fear wrapped in overly polite language. It was Karen. No question. Jack canceled his remaining briefings, made one call to his federal contact in the fraud division, and rerouted directly to Brookridge Cove under an official visit warrant issued under Section 121B of the Private Neighborhood Oversight Act. He arrived in town with no public announcement, rented an unmarked home within the community, and began quietly observing. What he found chilled him. Karen, or Claire, or CW, or whatever name she was using, had refined her tactics. She no longer needed to show up, shout, or patrol with a clipboard. She had created a completely virtual authority. Her notices were distributed by a third-party automation software tied to vague community standards documents that referenced policies no one had ever voted on. Her payments went to an anonymous holding account in Delaware, and she had even set up a feedback system that redirected complaints into a black hole, giving the illusion of due process while silencing opposition completely. Jack didn't confront her directly this time. Instead, he worked backwards, mapping out the structure of her shadow operation. He traced the automated system back to a hosting server in New Mexico, licensed under a consultancy called Horizon Path Advisors. The registration agent for the LLC turned out to be a shell company used in over 17 HOA communities nationwide, most of which had experienced sudden changes in board enforcement in the past 2 years. Karen had evolved her model into a scalable operation. She wasn't just starting over, she was franchising fear. Jack realized this was no longer a local abuse issue. This was national. He sent a secure message to his DOJ handler marked urgent priority, and within 48 hours he had a task force assigned to him. Together, they began issuing silent subpoenas to every HOA board that had processed payments or distributed compliance notices from Horizon Path Advisors. They also began interviewing residents from affected communities, recording their stories, collecting printed violations, financial statements, and email communications. Every letter, every fine, every document Karen had touched was now evidence. And just like before, she had underestimated the people she tried to control. Renee, Travis, Greg, none of them had ever considered themselves activists. But when Jack showed them the scope of what she'd done, they turned into warriors for justice. Greg coded a script to scrape the compliance portal's backend. Renee started a podcast that quickly gained thousands of downloads, and Travis organized a neighborhood legal fund to challenge the HOA's charter in court. Karen, though still hidden, wasn't blind. She must have sensed the walls closing in, because her communications became more frantic. New violation letters started referencing security concerns and urgent need for compliance to prevent community decline. Then the HOA board president, under immense pressure, resigned and posted a public letter admitting he had never met the compliance officer in person, had only communicated through an encrypted messaging app, and had received monthly incentive bonuses for every home that paid a fine without dispute. That letter went viral. National news picked it up. And suddenly, Karen's empire wasn't just exposed, it was infamous. Journalists, legal analysts, and homeowner advocates began dissecting the Horizon Path model, revealing its blueprint for power without accountability. And at the center of it all was a woman who had once cried wolf so many times that she'd forgotten what it meant to be heard truthfully. Her model relied on silence, on compliance, on fear. But Jack had flipped her system against her. Every silent victim became a loud witness. Every fear-driven rule became fuel for rebellion. The final takedown happened not in a courtroom, but online. Jack's team worked with cybersecurity experts to breach the hidden admin panel of Horizon Path's network. Using data Karen herself had mistakenly uploaded years ago from Silvercrest Pines, they found her real name, social security number, bank account history, and a direct financial link to every HOA she'd infected. The DOJ issued a federal arrest warrant under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act (RICO). She was indicted not just for harassment, not just for fraud, but for building a criminal enterprise designed to extort, suppress, and manipulate citizens under the false banner of community management. Karen Whitmore, aka Claire Windsor, was arrested in a private Airbnb 3 hours outside Brookridge Cove while trying to pack up hard drives and cash. When agents knocked, she didn't resist. She looked exhausted, gray-haired, thinner than Jack remembered. As they cuffed her, she whispered to the agent, "I was just trying to keep things in order." The agent replied, "You created chaos and called it order." She was taken into custody, and her trial would become a televised federal case that, when inspired a movement back in Brookridge Cove and across the country. Homeowners celebrated not just because a tyrant was gone, but because they finally saw that they had rights and that even the most deeply embedded system of abuse could be dismantled when exposed. Jack declined the media spotlight, as usual. He returned to Washington to finalize his comprehensive report, which would become the foundation for sweeping HOA reform proposals nationwide. He had done what few believed possible, exposed the hidden structure of fear, turned victims into fighters, and stopped a woman who had believed herself untouchable. But Jack knew there were more Karens out there, more shadows in pretty neighborhoods, and until every last one of them was brought into the light, his mission would continue. The trial of Karen Whitmore became a national reckoning, not just for the HOA world but for every quiet suburban enclave that had ever sacrificed freedom in the name of order. The courtroom was packed with victims flown in from multiple states, people who had once received anonymous citations for wind chimes, garden gnomes, or political flags, now standing tall behind the prosecution as living proof of her system's cruelty. Karen sat stoically through it all, wearing a fitted gray suit, her once commanding posture diminished by the weight of federal charges. The media painted her as a suburban tyrant, a domestic dictator dressed in PTA charm and legal loopholes. But Jack Donovan knew better. She was a warning, a case study, a woman who had discovered just how much power could be exploited when rules lacked oversight, and who had been allowed to grow her control unchecked because no one dared question her until it was too late. The prosecutors dismantled her defense with chilling precision. They played audio recordings from whistleblower interviews, displayed financial records tracing thousands of dollars in fabricated fines back to her secret LLCs, and exposed internal emails where she had written directives like "Don't give them time to think, infuse and fine. And it's not illegal if no one knows the bylaw exists." The final nail was a surveillance video showing Karen in her Claire Windsor disguise, sitting at a rented storage unit transferring hard drives while whispering into a burner phone, "I'll just do it again somewhere else. These sheep never learn." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before delivering a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts, including fraud, wire tampering, civil rights violations, and operating an unlicensed regulatory body across state lines. The sentence was swift: 25 years in federal prison with no parole eligibility for the first 15, but even that wasn't the true conclusion. Outside the courtroom, Jack Donovan stood quietly near the courthouse steps, watching reporters swarm, homeowners cry tears of relief, and advocacy groups rally with banners calling for legislative reform. He didn't speak to the cameras. He never did. His work wasn't about applause. It was about systems, about the invisible frameworks of control that people like Karen had mastered. But this time, his report had gone beyond the DOJ. His findings were now being reviewed by congressional committees looking to draft a new bill titled the Homeowners Justice Act, a sweeping reform package aimed at eliminating unregulated enforcement within private communities, requiring all HOA boards to undergo annual audits, and giving residents legal protection from retaliation for speaking out. Jack's quiet investigation had triggered something bigger than he imagined, a slow but powerful unraveling of the fear that had ruled so many lives behind perfectly painted fences. In Silvercrest Pines, they celebrated quietly. The new community charter flourished. Children played late into the evening without being shushed, and Paige sent Jack a handwritten letter saying, "You didn't just save us, you changed what we thought was possible." In Brookridge Cove, Travis and Renee co-founded a national coalition called Neighbors for Accountability, and Greg's podcast was now syndicated on major platforms, featuring weekly stories from others who had lived under the shadow of HOA Karens like Whitmore. But Jack didn't stay in one place long. The morning after the sentencing, he packed a single suitcase, locked the apartment he rarely slept in, and took a government vehicle bound for the airport. A new assignment was waiting in another county, Another name beginning to surface, another set of files arriving on his desk. He knew this mission would never be about stopping just one person. Karen was simply the most dangerous kind of beginning, a warning dressed as order, a lesson in how silence creates space for abuse. What made her dangerous wasn't just her power, it was the comfort with which she wielded it, the belief that her intentions were righteous even when her actions caused fear, loss, and pain. Jack had seen it before, and he would see it again. Power given without accountability always seeks to justify itself, and there would always be another neighborhood, another clipboard, another community rule twisted into a weapon. That evening he sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, sipping black coffee and reviewing his next case. The names were different, the structures slightly changed, but the signs were all too familiar. A woman issuing fines without signatures, a board refusing to hold open meetings, a community where residents whispered instead of speaking up. He looked out the window at the setting sun and nodded to himself, not out of fatigue, but determination. There was still so much work to do. As the plane taxied, he pulled out a pen and wrote a single line across the top of his folder. Watch for the ones who smile when they say it's just the rules. Because he had learned long ago that tyranny didn't always march down the street in boots, it often whispered through mailboxes, dressed in pastel, claiming to protect what was good. But Jack Donovan would be there. Wherever they re-emerged, a quiet guardian with a badge, a file, and an unwavering purpose to protect the people no one else noticed until it was too late. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Sham Story YouTube channel and press the bell icon so you never miss an update. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.